Welcome to NTTBF Presents Family Matters Graphic Novel Panel. I'm Christina Taylor, one of the librarians at Round Rock High School in Round Rock, Texas, the immediate past chair of the Texas Maverick Graphic Novel Reading List Committee, and the social media manager of the Young Adult Roundtable from the Texas Library Association. And I am thrilled to be moderating tonight's discussion between the four of you. So let's get started. Would each of you begin by formally introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about your body of work, and the graphic novel you'll be showcasing tonight. We'll start with you, Victoria.
Sure. Hi. Sorry, I'm Victoria Jamieson. I'm the author and illustrator of a few graphic novels. My first graphic novel was Roller Girl, about roller derby. My next book was called All's Fair in Middle School, about a kid working in a Renaissance festival. I have some other younger graphic novels too, called The Great Pet Escape and The Great Art Caper, about hamsters. And then my newest book that I'll be talking mostly about tonight is different. It's, for one thing, it's co-authored, and I should say right off the bat, I'm really sorry Omar couldn't join us tonight. He's actually leaving to go back to Dadaab tomorrow. So Omar is the co-author of this book. This book is a story of his life. Omar is the older brother that you see on the cover. Hassan is his younger brother. And they were both born in Somalia and fled to Kenya, a refugee camp in Kenya when Omar was 4. And they were without parents. And it was just the story of Omar's life growing up and what it's like to be a kid in a refugee camp. And it spans his whole life from age 4 through 19 when he was resettled to the United States. So again, I'm sorry he couldn't join us tonight, but I'll do my best to represent the book as best I can on my own. So that's me. And I'll just say before I pass it off, I'm really glad to be here. I have so many, I've visited lots of schools in Texas, and Texas has a soft spot in my heart. I'm glad to be here tonight. So I'll pass it off to Kathleen.
Hi, yeah, I'm also so thrilled to be here tonight. I am a cartoonist and I live and work in Vancouver, BC, Canada. And I sort of came to comics via sort of web comics. My first graphic novel was published a couple of years ago by Cloudscape Comics, which is a Vancouver-based publisher. And my most recent book, which just came out, is called Joe, an adaptation of Little Women, sort of. And it's a modern day adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's classic American novel, Little Women. And it sort of takes the March sisters from the mid-1800s into the modern day, navigating middle school and the start of high school, and sort of friendships and feelings and family and all that stuff. And it's told through a queer lens. Yeah. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Kiku.
Hi, I'm Kiku Hughes, and this is actually my first graphic novel, Displacement. I'm a cartoonist in Seattle, and I wrote and illustrated. And Displacement is the story of a fictional teenage version of myself being pulled back in time to experience Japanese American incarceration alongside my grandmother, Ernestina. So it's a story about family history, about American history, and the lasting effects of these kinds of large community traumas. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm passing it off to Trung.
Hello, my name is Trung Le Nguyen, and I am an author and cartoonist. This is also my very first graphic novel. I'll be primarily talking about the magic fish. Yeah, I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm so excited to be doing any kind of event with like a Texas book event. I've heard so many incredible things about Texas book events, so I'm really pumped to be here.
Thank you. So, will each of you explain your creative process? Like, what worked, what didn't work, and how did you know? All right, Victoria.
So each book is a little different. Each one starts off as like a complete mess. And the writing part for me is the hardest part. And I usually do most of my writing first. Like when I start off on a new project, I do lots of just drawing and writing together, which is also a mess. And then when I do the writing, that's a mess. And then the art is where I finally feel like, okay, maybe this won't be a disaster. But up until that point, like everything is just chaos. This book was different because again, I was working with someone for the first time, and it was a very different experience. And it was, in some ways, it was easier because when I felt lost and in chaos, I would just call Omar and I would be like, help me, let's figure this out. And I didn't have to do it all on my own. And a lot of my other books were based, I guess, on some of my own experiences. Like I really tapped into my feelings or my backgrounds with playing roller derby or working in a Ren fair. But this, I couldn't do that. Like anytime I tried to insert myself into the story, it was just wrong. So yeah, a lot of my creative process for this book was instead of telling a story, I was listening to a story. So whenever I ran into a problem, I would just ask questions to Omar and listen to what he was saying and just try and present that as honestly as I could in the book. So it taught me a lot. Even, my next book's not a collaboration, but it taught me to ask questions. So I did lots of interviews for my next book where I just asked and listened as a way to help my creative process. So I hope to keep doing that in future books. It was really helpful. Oh, Kathleen, go ahead.
I very much relate to the sort of everything starts off as chaos and a mess and sort of try to find your way into making it make sense. I feel like, my creative process is probably fairly similar. I have the idea and sort of, I do a lot of, I feel like now more than ever, I'm doing more on the computer, just sort of brainstorming and stuff, but I always am sort of thinking big picture and working smaller. So like trying to break down sort of the arcs and the beats of the story, especially with Joe, because it's an adaptation. I love Little Women. It's like my favorite book of all time. So this was a dream project for me. I was looking at the original text, which is very long. It spans the sort of like adolescence and adulthood of these characters and being like, okay, this has to be a 250-page graphic novel, and I want it to feel like complete and rich and not like we're just zooming past things. So I tried to pull the main themes from the novel, which are sort of like finding your voice and finding your place of belonging, and learning to work with other people, and then trying to sort of transpose that to modern day. So I was really trying to figure out the main story beats and like pulling scenes from the book that felt like they could work somehow in modern day. And at the same time, I guess because I was, working with an editor at that point, doing a lot of character sketches, whereas I think in my own projects, I maybe do the character sketches a little bit later. I'm often starting with like the voice of the story in my head before moving into the art. And then from there, my script passes I always start off with a very vague script that's sort of just going through the flow of the story before I even start thinking about like panels and pages and stuff like that. And then, I break it down into panels and pages and do thumbnails and I pencil on paper, and then I scan it into the computer to ink, and then I color it on the computer as well. I used to ink traditionally, but I just find it's easier when working with an editor to make revisions when it's digital. But I like the question of like, how do you know when it's right and when it's working? And I feel like that's where I really need an editor. I so appreciate getting to collaborate with someone where they can say either like, this isn't working, how can we make it work? Or like, you know what, this is good, because I always have that voice in the back of my mind where I'm like, is this right? I don't know. So it helps to have sort of that external validation. Yeah, and I'll pass it over to you, Kiku.
So sort of combining Victoria and Kathleen's answers for mine, I think the front end of Displacement was a lot of asking questions and figuring out the major story beats, which for me were the things that I had grown up hearing about the camps, stories that even though camps weren't talked about a lot in my family, there are certain significant events that became really important enough that I heard about them growing up. So those became my major story beats. And so knowing those sorts of events, things like the Quakers showing up and giving Christmas presents to people, and like the murder of James Wakasa, which is a major event in the book. I knew these were going to be like the major points of emotional impact, and I knew they were important because they had been given to me. So from there, my questions became, what was the context for these events, and how can I find out more about what was going on, more than just what I'd been told? So there was a lot of research up front, and every answer that you get leads you down another rabbit hole of 20 more questions. But that's kind of the fun part of research, for me at least, because I ended up learning a lot more about my family and about myself by sort of looking into these. So that was really cool. And yeah, everything else, writing, drawing, it's all a mess until it comes together. And even then you kind of look back and think, oh no, what was I doing here? But yeah, it's so great having an editor to tell you that things are going okay when you don't feel like they are, or even just a second set of eyes to, pass it on to. So yeah, Trump.
Oh, sure. These are all lovely responses. Thank you so much. I realized that I completely forgot to tell you about the actual book. So The Magic Fish is about a young boy, Vietnamese American boy, and his mother, who were refugees, and they are kind of learning English alongside each other. And so he's much more versed in speaking English, and she speaks mostly Vietnamese. And so they are looking into going to the library and checking out a lot of books in order to find ways to communicate important things to each other. And so because the structure of my book is a story within a story, and so I'm telling 4 different stories, the characters reach into 3 different fairy tales and into the mother's past in order to come around to finding a fuller context by which they can communicate with each other. And so the bulk of my story was a lot of research, because I had to do a lot of really careful research into how we envision stories in our heads. It's a lot about, especially within graphic novels, you think about visual media not being something that is, especially research heavy. And I think we take visuals for granted. And so oftentimes I would have to go in and make sure that all of my iconography was looking exactly the way that it needed to, because the ways that we consume visual language is something that I wanted to explore within the book as well. And so I did a lot of research on why fairy tales look the way that they do within the American popular imagination, and what did Vietnamese people wear in the 1950s, and what did ballet houses look like in the 1980s. And I got to just do a lot of really intentional searching and researching for all of the kind of specific details that I wanted the reader to be able to pick up on. And it's very affirming to hear everyone else telling me that their writing process is very chaotic, because this marriage of like text and images together into its own kind of text is incredibly complicated. And I'm still figuring out exactly what my process is. I thought that I, wanted to do things really rigidly and write first and then thumbnail and then draw, but apparently that's not how things work for me at all. And I'm exploring the process of inchworming, where I draw and sketch out the pages and write at the same time in order to understand exactly what goes on the page. So there are a lot of technical considerations that everyone else has already touched on, and I'm very glad to hear that that is also that's a common process. So yeah, thank you so much. That was a great first question.
Thank you. I feel like you guys kind of touched on this as you were talking about your process, and that your process was often very much influenced by what was important to you and what you wanted to draw out of the text, and you wanted to bring that to the audience. But I'm going to ask you to talk about it more explicitly now. Why do these graphic novels matter to you? And in that, how much time did you spend on them? And why was that time well spent? Victoria.
Yeah, this was an interesting book because when I embarked on When Stars Are Scattered with Omar, I think neither one of us really knew what was going to happen with the book. I guess that's true with any book where you start it and you don't know what it's going to end up looking like. But with this one, it was just, I was volunteering with a local refugee resettlement agency in my area. And my family moved to Pennsylvania, and it was a new state. We moved from Oregon. And I went to Omar's place of work, which is a place called Church World Service, which is an agency that helps new arrivals to the United States kind of find apartments and get, do taxes and English lessons and all the things you have to learn when you're new to the country. And I was just kind of touring around his office. And, I mentioned that I was a graphic novelist, and a coworker said, well, you should meet Omar. He's working on a memoir. He's looking for a co-author at the moment. And so you two should talk. And so we just sort of sat down and started talking and wondering if we could collaborate and what that would look like. Like we were like, should it be a picture book? We eventually settled on graphic novel because it's kind of we could tell a longer story, a more in-depth story. And yeah, I only tend to think in graphic novel format. So it does take a long time. That was the second part of the question, right? How long does it take? I kind of wish I could write other kinds of books because graphic novels just take forever. But it took about, I guess, about 3 years for the whole thing to come together, from just the first meeting and months of just talking and seeing what the story would look like, to the actual drawing, which was more my side of the work. It's about 3 years together. Was that everything in your question? I feel like it was, right? Okay, I'll pass it on.
Oh,
You're
wait,
next,
I
Kathleen.
did. There was one other part. Is
Okay.
why was that time well spent?
Why was that time well spent? Well, I wanted to tell, first of all, I only really think in graphic novel form, but it seemed to make sense for this book because, it's talking about a kid's life in a refugee camp. And so like you can see on the cover, the tents that Omar and Hassan lived in. And so as an American who's never been to a refugee camp, when I picture a tent, I picture like the one I bought at a camping goods store that I never use. Like, I don't like camping, but I didn't picture tents like this, where it was actually made from tree branches that are bent in and have tarps over them. So yeah, it seemed like it's time well spent, because I think graphic novels are a really inviting format for kids, because you can step into another kid's world and see, oh, this is what their house looks like. This is what their school looks like. It just makes it more welcoming and warm, as if you really know the kids in a graphic novel. That's how I felt about all the characters in all your graphic novels. Like, it's just a welcoming kind of format, in my opinion. So yeah, that's it. On to you, Kathleen.
I so relate to like graphic novels and comics being like the only way that you think, or just in an innate way to communicate, because for me it's very similar. I've been drawing comics since before I knew what comics were, really. It just sort of made sense as a way to communicate. And I'm trying to think, Joe was actually an idea that I had years and years ago. I think it sort of first had this idea, like I was 17, I'd moved on my own, like across the country. I grew up in Toronto, moved to Vancouver. And I love Little Women. And I was rereading it for the like a millionth time. And I was like, oh, it would be really fun to like do a comic, but like bring it into modern day. But I don't know how to do that. So that idea went on the shelf for quite some time. And then back in 2017, I think, middle of 2017, one of my acquaintances on Twitter, my friend Kayla Miller, she tweeted, like, does anyone I know like Little Women? And I was like, oh my God, that's my favorite book. Like, yes, I love it. And she DM'd me and was like, oh, my agent is interested in pitching a modern day Little Women graphic novel. Like, I don't want to do it. Would you be interested? Can I put your name forward? And I was like, oh yeah, yes, please. So then I connected with her agent, who became my agent. And we started sort of working on a pitch together. And we were pitching that fall winter of 2017, and then sort of wound up, things worked out with HarperCollins in early 2018, and I got started on the book pretty immediately. So I think it was about 2 years from starting writing the script to finishing the final art, because I think I finished that earlier this year, but also this year has felt like an infinity of time. So it really could have been any time. I don't know. But yeah, so I think it was about 2 years for me. But I also know that I like tend to work at a fairly fast pace. Just naturally, that's my rhythm as an artist. But why was the time well spent is a really interesting question. Because I do like to think it was well spent. I'm quite proud of the book. And I, for me, comics in many ways are a way of like in processing my own thoughts and feelings and like putting them out into the world, whether I'm, doing a fictional story or doing something more autobiographical. And yeah, it was a project I always wanted to do. There's such like a theme of love and caring in the original work, and like finding ways to show the people around you that you love them and stuff like that. So that's just a really nice theme to work with. So I don't know, I guess for me, yeah, of course it was very, very worthwhile, and I hope people enjoy reading it. Yeah, I think I answered everything in that question. Did I? I don't know. All right, over to you, Kiku.
Okay. Yeah, I'm actually going to start with the time period, or how long it took, because I think that's a big part of it. I definitely had something like the very beginnings of this book, I think, have been with me my entire life, which is thinking about the consequences, the long-term consequences of something like Japanese American incarceration. To me personally, that meant questioning this sort of distance I felt from Japanese American culture and from, I don't speak Japanese. We don't do a lot of Japanese things in my household. And I had grown up with that sort of knowledge and question about why that was. So it came to a head when I was researching this book and realizing, oh, this is why. So I think even though that question sort of formed the foundation of why I wanted to tell the book as an intergenerational story, the book itself really came together in 2016 during the election. So I have that as sort of a concrete marker of it took almost 4 years, because it's when I sort of started thinking about it as an actual book. So yeah, it took a long time. And comics do take a very long time. And in terms of sort of what it means to me and why a graphic novel and the importance of comics, one thing that I found that was really cool when I was doing my research was one of my most important assets was a book by an author named Mine Ukubo, who made a book called Citizen 13660, which was an illustrated diary that she made while she was in the camps. It's Tampere Assembly Center and Topaz Relocation Camp, which were the same ones that my grandmother was in. And she was drawing what she experienced every day, and she actually published all her drawings, all her diary entries, I think in 1946, something very, very soon after the camps closed, she had this published. It was one of the first documentations, like first person documentations of camp. And it was an illustrated diary for all intents and purposes. It was a comic. So it sort of cemented the history of telling this story as a visual narrative, which was very cool and sort of made me feel like comics was a really good genre, I guess, or format to put this story out into. And so, yeah, on a personal level, it was time well spent because I feel like I learned a lot about myself. And in researching, I was also able to share a lot about my family with my mom, which was very cool, things that she didn't know about her own family. And we had those kinds of conversations that we hadn't had before. So it really opened that up, which was very cool personally. On a more universal level, I guess, I really hoped that it was worthwhile in showing the lasting effects of, current policies of things that you see now being done to, marginalized communities, and knowing that violence is never just perpetrated once. It is a repeated thing through the generations. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about a lot more. And yeah, so I hope the book at least can make that an accessible lesson to kids. Trung?
I'm going to start with, so my graphic novel took me about 1.5 years-ish, almost 2 years, which I'm now understanding is kind of quick because everyone is spending a huge chunk of their lives on their books. I was very, very expedient about it. It was really the only thing that I had to work on. And so I got to focus all of my energy on it, which, really, really helped that process along. And I think that, like, graphic novels and comic books in general are so important to me as a reader because they were the first books that I felt were very accessible as someone who learned English second. And I really treasure every experience that I've ever had cracking open a book and being drawn in by the visuals first. And I oftentimes like to interrogate the relationships that comic books have with illustrated books. Like, I think a lot of times most readers, and myself for a long time included, kind of conflate picture books, images within a book with easy reading and with materials that are kind of fluffy and not very deep, kind of shallow reading. And that is something that I want to push back on as much as I can, because what winds up happening is that with books with visual elements in them, when there are images that are accessible, it helps bring people in. And so within illustrated books, I find that oftentimes, like, if you're a very early reader, like, you'll see the picture first and then you'll kind of work your way along with the words, and it'll provide context to give you a better idea of what's going on with the images. And then as you get a little bit older, you'll read a book, you'll read the text, and then you'll see an accompanying image that will illustrate things. And so it'll supplement that text. And so that's kind of what that relationship looks like. And so it continues to sort of fade out into this, okay, now I'm going to read books that have no images at all. And it's going to be a grown-up book, and it's going to be, and this is, you know, what real reading is, quote unquote. And I find that we all come to literacy with a visual vocabulary, but we don't interrogate it very much. And media literacy is so focused on, you know, the images that we consume, how to identify patterns. And comic books are such a wonderful vehicle to help a reader do that. And it's a wonderful tool to help you navigate real life and figure out like what news is real, and like who is, you know, who is trying to pull one over on you with flashy graphics. Like there are visual patterns that you can pick up on. And so I think that developing like a sense of visual literacy as a text is something that's really important to me as well. So comic books will always be like really important to me in terms of the ways that it gets people to engage with the world around them. I think the process that worked for me the best in terms of putting this together as like a whole project was that I had to think about my book as more of an essay, because I'm not someone who's a natural storyteller. I like things to have like a beginning, a middle, and end. I needed there to be a thesis and a theme, and I needed for things to come back up again. And so I had to reframe the ways that I thought that a story could be told. And so doing it within like a graphic novel format really helped ease me into the process of thinking about stories as like this thing that I can kind of look down on and take a look from the top down. So yeah, comic books are great. Why was it worth the time? Oh, so I spent quite a lot of my time drawing traditionally, and I had to learn how to work digitally. And so even though I feel like a lot of my time making the work was me kind of stumbling through processes that were unfamiliar, it was an incredibly valuable learning experience. And I shored up so many skills that I didn't realize that I would need in order to make a comic, because apparently comics require a very specific set of skills, and you have to be very good at doing all of those things. You have to be a really good editor, a really good draftsperson. You have to be really communicative. So it teaches you all kinds of skills. And, you know, if you're learning something, that's never time wasted.
I love the fact that all of your responses drew upon why comics was an appropriate medium for the stories that you have to tell, and how much those visuals were critical to making this information accessible to the audience. And so with Trung's discussion of accessibility and how that marriage and interplay between the images and the words and telling the story is a perfect segue into my next question, which is each of you in each of these works tackle some very heavy topics that could easily be difficult or awkward to navigate. And yet you've made them accessible to the audience so that they can take away something from the story that you have to tell. And so my question for you is, what were your guiding principles for those choices that you made, so that we are able as the audience to have that experience with your work? And what was your reasoning behind those choices? Victoria.
Yeah, we had to make a lot of choices, because I think one of the early choices we made that kind of shaped the rest of the choices was how old the kids were going to be in the book. So most of the book takes place when Omar's about 11. And we really wanted it to be accessible for younger kids as well as older teens. And that was maybe partly based on my own, like the way I think. Like I don't consider myself a YA writer. I'm definitely a middle grade writer. So a lot of the choices we made were tailoring the story so that an 11-year-old could read the book. And a lot of Omar's story is very hard. One of the scenes we had to discuss how to portray was when he left Somalia because he saw his father killed in a field in front of him. And so how do you put something like that in a book for an 11-year-old? Like, it's true, you know, he saw that when he was a kid. It's not, kids see violence in front of them all the time, but how do we present it in a way that, you know, I don't want kids to have to, no kid should have to see that kind of violence. So how do you present it truthfully, but still in a way that's, you know, kids can consume and not get overwhelmed by? So in that particular scene, we just had, well, Omar was like playing with some toys when this happened, and we'd always see the men come up with guns. We hear the shots, but we don't see anything. We just kind of hear the bangs, and then Omar's toys go flying and he runs back home to his mother. So we had a lot of discussions on things like that, and a lot of really terrible stories that we couldn't put in the book because it was just too much. When Omar and Hassan fled, it was like a 3 or 4 month journey to leave Somalia to Kenya. There's a lot of violence towards women. How do you portray that? So we didn't touch on much of that because like that's a lot for a kid to handle. Again, even though kids do handle it all the time. So a lot of those things are done in the art. And I think Trung, I'm really interested in what you said about how our visual literacy and how that plays such a big part in comics. Like they're not as simple as they seem. So I did make reference in some of the scenes where you see men looming over young girls and nothing's said in the text. And hopefully, maybe kids won't see what's happening, but then the grownups, there's something, that visual relationship of like a big grown man and a young girl in front of them, you kind of know as a reader visually, like what that entails, what that implies. So yeah, that's, you're right. This is going to lead into it. Christina, you said at the beginning, like this might get a deep, dark conversation, but yeah, a lot of the book was taking deep, big problems in the world and compressing it in a way so that kids can empathize with other kids, but not be overwhelmed. I don't know, maybe I want to hear what everyone else has to say about this, because I think all of our books sort of did that sort of thing. So Kathleen, how about you?
Yeah, so sorry. My approach with sort of Jo and this reinterpretation of Little Women was to reimagine Jo as an explicitly queer character. She comes out as gay in the book. It's not really a spoiler, it's kind of on the book jacket and in the book marketing. But for me, like I was in middle school in the mid-2000s, and that was a time when, oh my gosh, you could not like walk through the hallways of a school without hearing like gay and lesbian used as pejoratives. And that wasn't necessarily an experience that I wanted to bring into this book. I wanted to sort of offer up a safe space in my writing for kids to come to and like feel supported, because it's true. Like you, as a queer person, you may not always be received as warmly or as kindly as you would like to be. And as you should be, and as you deserve to be. But I think we can often use stories and literature as ways to sort of find the reactions and the belongings that we may not always find in the world. So for me, I wanted it to be like, almost like, when like, oh my God, sorry, my voice is like breaking and I don't mean it to, but when Marmee like gives Jo a hug, like I want the reader to be feeling that too. Oh my God, sorry, I don't know why I'm getting emotional. It's been a long day, but it's important to me to show sort of the positive and the welcoming and the warm, and even like not even just for like the readers who identify with Jo and who see themselves in the queer characters, but for everyone else too, to maybe be given a roadmap for how to respond when someone comes out to them. And to be given sort of the experience of like, well, I can say that's wonderful, and I can say I love you, and I can say I'm proud of you, and stuff like that. Because I think sometimes people need a little help with knowing how to respond to things. So that's kind of what I was trying to do with this book, was just create like a warm place for a reader to go and feel seen or feel comfortable and feel heard, I guess, is kind of what I was going with. Yeah, sorry. Over to you, Kiku.
Yeah, that was beautiful. And yeah, so I think for me, early on, I knew I had read, when I was a kid, I didn't learn a lot about camp in school. And what I remember from it were a lot of kids' books that were very simplified. The experience was very flattened, I guess. And a lot of it was either like about sports and baseball and ways that people like found fun in camp, or just kind of like a very basic sort of monolithic experience explained. And even among Japanese Americans, I think there was sort of this idea of the story as being very one note, people, surviving, this phrase gaman, which is like, we're getting through it. And that was kind of the sort of monolithic experience that I grew up hearing and reading about. So I think what was really important for me when approaching the story was to try to give as many different opinions to different characters as I could. Get characters in there who had different ideas about what was happening to them, had different feelings, came from different backgrounds, because I think the temptation to flatten an entire community into one monolithic experience really causes a lot of problems. It's the root of a lot of problems. So I really wanted to create a story where different characters could be met and they all had different opinions about what was happening. Yeah, so that was one of the main sort of approaches that I had getting into it. I don't even, is that the question? Did I answer that? Okay. Yeah, because I guess it was just, yeah, there were a lot of complicated parts of camp history. For example, there was a moment called the Loyalty Questionnaire, which was a questionnaire that the government passed out to everyone in camp who was over the age of 17. And it was meant to weed out the loyal Americans from the disloyal Japanese. And it was a ridiculous notion, but it caused a lot of debate among people at camp, because there were certain questions that seemed very loaded, seemed like maybe they could be trick questions, seemed like reasons for the government to, enforce stricter punishments upon people. So there was a lot of debate. And I grew up hearing that people who answered no to 2 specific questions, called no boys, were kind of troublemakers. And that was kind of the, I guess, prejudice that was passed down to me. And researching that, I realized that there was a lot of, nuance to that. People were answering no to those questions out of a sense of civil duty, out of a sense of protest, of resistance. And I wanted to make sure, but then people, didn't answer no because they wanted to stay safe. They wanted to protect their children. They wanted to keep their families together. So there's so much, there's so much layering to that. And I wanted to give a depth to the experience and show the different, points of view that everybody had and struggled with. So.
Wow, I am just coming to appreciate just how beautifully curated this group of books is. Because I'm like, oh, stories about refugees and about immigrants and about family histories and about queerness. That's all what I'm about. And so the Magic Fish is a coming out story. It's about what happens when you don't have the language to discuss topics that are of importance to you. And I think especially with queer stories, we don't often discuss about how the language changes so frequently, to the extent that oftentimes we now are sort of alienated from generations before us. And so there's not really a lot of intergenerational dialogue there. And the Magic Fish specifically is about a young boy who wants to come out to his mother, and they find ways to try to discuss things when they don't have the benefit of a language, because coming out is already so difficult when you share a language, but oftentimes you may not share the same vocabulary or experiences, and you have to draw upon metaphors. And I think a unique experience about anyone who kind of lives their lives kind of at the margins, any marginalized identity, our relationship to stories and our relationship to literature is oftentimes of empathy. We always find ourselves empathizing with people who are different than ourselves, who don't share our experiences. I have no problem empathizing with princess stories growing up, and I had no problem empathizing with sports stories growing up. And so it was just this it's this exercise in empathy that we kind of get to exercise all of the time. But what I realized as an adult is that whenever difficult topics come up, whenever there's discussion about queerness, whenever there's a discussion about racism or immigration or refugee statuses, we like to keep those topics at arm's length. We academicize them. We think about them in terms that can fit in a syllabus. Those, being able to contain those experiences in a syllabus is such a comforting thing, but it also takes us away from the emotional core of a lot of the stories that we want to tell. And I wanted to tell a story that was not told from the top down. I wanted it to be told from the perspective and the priorities of the characters that are just living their lives and trying their best to care for each other, despite not really understanding how. I wanted to tell a story where the characters could demand the empathy of readers as opposed to just the curiosity of readers. I'm not trying to edify people. I just want someone to be able to empathize with someone who might not be, who might not share a lot of their experiences. And so that is kind of the crux of why graphic novels are really important as like an accessible medium, as a space to share difficult stories, because euphemisms work differently within graphic novels. Visual language allows you the flexibility to imply things that you would not be able to get away with in text in much the same ways. And because people's relationships to text and to images can be so different from one another, we're never really reading the same story, and everybody comes at it from a different perspective to begin with. And so there's just a multitude of ways to access someone's imagination and to get them to exercise their compassion. And I think that is my favorite part about making books and making comic books in particular.
Wow. Those were enlightening, but very heavy. And I feel like we just kind of need a minute to let that like kind of sink in and wash over us. But I don't want us to stay there too long, because we did talk about the emotional weight of them. So my next question is just gonna bring a little bit more levity in to kind of bring us back, give us a little bit of a reprieve from the intimacy of those responses. So my question is, for each of you, which accolade for your work, for any of your work, which accolade are you most proud of and why? Victoria.
So I saw this question on the sheet and I wasn't really sure how to answer it. Because the honest answer is like, yeah, it was really great to win a Newbery honor for Roller Girl. And like, it just makes your book more accessible, or more, like I was kind of allowed to do what I want after that, you know what I mean? And like, it meant more kids would read the books. So it sounds kind of weird to be like, yeah, the winning, because I know you're supposed to say like, oh, those medals don't matter, but like, it really mattered to me. Like, it really changed my life, like honestly changed my life. And it let me do, books like this. And Omar and I were sitting last night for the National Book Awards, and like, that's pretty weird. But especially this year, like, because we were sitting like in a green room Zoom, like for the National Book Awards. So that kind of shows you like it is a little silly, any like medals that you get. But the other side of that is like more people read your books. And it sounds like the cheesy answer to your question, but it's also the real answer. Like, the best accolade is when we get letters from kids telling us like how much the book meant to them. I was actually in a Zoom with Omar. He was giving a talk to readers about his organization, Refugee Strong, just before this Zoom call. And there were so many kids he stayed on for so long answering questions from kids. And they're like, kids were like having garage sales. One kid had a lemonade stand this summer and she gave all the profits to Refugee Strong. And so it's just so amazing and so heartwarming to hear kids like just wanting to get involved and like working with their local agencies to help refugees. So yeah, honestly, that is the best. A kid sent this really cute drawing to Omar. I don't know, it's just working. I would never write for adults because kids are the best. And it's just so fun hearing from kid readers and how the books affect them. Yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah. Anytime somebody takes the time out of their day to reach out and say that my work touched them in some way is just like, it just makes my day. It's like the best thing ever. And I think like one of the wonderful things about Joe is it's my first book with a big publisher, so it had sort of the widest reach, and so many members of my family, like they've never understood what I do. Like they're lovely, they love me and we get along, but we're very, very different people. And like they could like hold in their hands something that I'd made and like see me through it in a way. And that was very, very moving to get those messages from sort of my aunts and my cousins, who I love very dearly, telling me that they're like, wow, this looked like it took a long time. And I'm like, okay, thank you. The one that really meant a lot to me is, I might get a little like emotional, but that's just where I'm at today, I guess. My dad called me to say that he cried reading my book. And that, like, I didn't expect that. Like, I knew that he was going to read my book, but I didn't expect him to be like moved emotionally by my book. And that felt very, very validating, because, you know, you write stuff and you don't know, you think maybe there's some like emotional impact there, but you don't really know until somebody else reads it. And that meant a lot to me, just feeling, I guess, seen by the people in my life through my work was very, very meaningful. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, sort of similar. I think the messages that has meant most to me after displacement came out were messages from other Yonsei, like fourth generation Japanese Americans, who, you know, shared so many experiences as, you know, reading the book sort of helped them put into words the kind of distance that they had felt and from their own culture and from their history, and sort of finding that way to reconnect. And I didn't really expect that, but it meant a lot, because you know, it's been a long process, I think, trying to figure that out myself. And if I could like help my nephews, for example, figure that out a little bit easier through this, then that would be awesome. So those meant a lot to me.
For me personally, I love it when people can identify like a line of dialogue that I've written that really resonates with them, because I've never written anything before. And so I'm always feeling a little bit, you know, I'm always very deep in my feelings whenever something that I've written resonates with someone. I'm someone who, you know, I'm very confident as a visual storyteller. And so whenever whenever I'm writing down, you know, words on a script, I'm just like, this is all meaningless and I have no idea what's good and what's junk. And so it's just really lovely when like something that I put down on a page where I'm not feeling like I have a lot of confidence in, like, really resonates with someone else. It just reminds me that, you know, other people will have a different relationship to your work than you as an author. So, you know, and sometimes those relationships are so much more loving than your own relationship with your work. Yeah, so that's just the thing. Like, if someone says that my writing spoke to them, that always makes me very happy.
Thank you. So, what did you guys learn in the process of writing these graphic novels? And it can be anything from self reflection, something you learned about yourself or the process, just something you learned. Victoria.
I learned so much. I think I didn't know the realities of life in a refugee camp. I think, you know, I knew what I saw in news clips. I didn't realize that the camp where Omar grew up, generations of families live there. Like, most people don't get resettled, that people are born in Dadaab, they live their whole life, they marry, they have kids, and they die there. And generations that happens. So that was probably one of the big, you know, was lessons I learned from the book. And just from working with Omar, it was such a lovely experience. And I feel like it was an honor to be kind of welcomed into his life and for him to entrust me with his story. So it kind of just taught me a lot about, yeah, how to act with my neighbors. And yeah, I just learned a lot from working with him. And like I said, I was on a Zoom with him tonight and he just stayed until every kid had asked all of their questions. And normally I'm like, okay, this was ending at 6:40, let's go. And he was like, I got time, let's just stay here and chat. And just that warmth and welcoming to kids asking questions, that's something I could do with. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I feel as well. I feel like I learned so much working on Joe. I feel like every graphic novel or every comic I do, I learned something through doing it. And this was my first time working with an editor seriously on a work. So I feel like, you know, working with the editors I worked with, started off with Jessica McLeish and then with Alexandra Cooper at HarperCollins, and they both just pushed me to be a much better writer. I really, really appreciated that. I feel like my first ideas are always like, they're fine, but like I need an editor to really help me get it to where it needs to go. And Joe is the longest work I've done in full color, so maybe that's a silly answer, but I learned a lot about color theory and coloring a book in full color, which I'm very pleased that I like treasure having that knowledge now. I'm excited to do more things in full color because I was a little bit scared going in because color's tricky, but yeah, it's really, really fun to get to sort of think up all these color palettes and all that stuff. So those are the two big things I learned working on the book.
Yeah, I think I talked a lot about personal discovery earlier, so I won't go into that again. But one thing that I learned, yeah, like Kathleen, this is the longest color, and for me, it was the longest thing I'd ever worked on by a magnitude of like 10. So I learned a lot about thumbnailing, which is the first part of the comic process, ideally, which is where you sort of plan out the whole book in miniature. And design all the pages and figure out where things are going to go. And I didn't know anything about that until I actually started this project, and then I had to learn on the fly. So I think that was technically, like the technical side of it, what I learned most, besides all the emotional, gushy stuff I talked about earlier. So,
aside from all of the technical stuff and all of the like emotional stuff that I touched on earlier, I think like the favorite things that I had learned within the process of making this graphic novel was in researching why people's visual imaginations look the way that they do. I really got a chance to think really deeply about like what people's inner worlds look like, because each, like the story, my book is told through the perspective of some of these characters, and they're telling fairy tales. And so I had to look into like, okay, the history of why do princess dresses look the way that they do in like the American popular imagination. So I had to go and look into like I learned things like fabric has to be rationed during war times, in order to like make materials for like parachutes and things like that. Something like things I would never ever think of. And so after wars, like in the mid-century, suddenly fabrics became something that you could use for clothing again. And so that's why dresses got so big after 1945. And so if you look into like the history of kind of the fashion houses and what happened to them after the Second World War, you'll notice like the use of fabrics are really, really extravagant. And then within the middle of the book, I had to think about, okay, what does the imagination of like a 60-year-old woman in 1998 who lived through the Vietnam War look like? If she were to tell a fairy tale, what do her princess dresses look like? And what do the plainclothes people look like? And what can clothing say about power? And what can it say about access? And just like those things as storytelling tools are all things that I'm going to take with me for the rest of my professional life, because those are all just incredibly valuable lessons. And so it was just, I learned not to take images for granted literally at all, because everything has a source.
All right, so my next question is just purely a bit of fun. If your graphic novels were people, what other graphic novels would they be friends with? Who would they sit around the lunch table with and chew the fat?
Once again, I saw this question on the list, but I still feel totally unprepared for some reason. I think I was thinking about it in terms of myself, like which graphic novels would I want to hang out with? So I think all of your graphic novels. I also loved Little Women growing up. So I don't know, I think I also really connected with Joe as a kid. So maybe Joe is who I would sit with. As for Omar and Hassan, I don't know. I think all of your books, I think Trung, you made the comment earlier that this panel is beautifully curated because the stories are all like have different themes in them. So it seems like it would be very interesting, like lunchtime conversation between the four of us. I wish we were doing this in person so we could chat for a while. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question. I think Omar and I both, Omar said he grew up without books. He just didn't have any books as a kid. So a lot of his work now is giving books to kids. So I think any and every book is welcome at our lunch table.
Yeah, this is such a fun question. And I did read it ahead of time. And then, of course, now that it's come back around, I'm like, oh, I've never read a book in my life. I don't know. whenever I have to name something, I'm like, I don't know, I've never seen anything in my life. But I feel like, yeah, this panel has been so wonderfully curated with the way that all of our works go together, which is really, really cool. So certainly all of your books. I also think like the Click series by Kayla Miller would probably pair really well with Joe. I feel like they'd really get along. Or a drama by Raina Telgemeier, if I may be so bold. But yeah.
Yeah, I did come up with an answer beforehand, so I would be prepared. And I think, yeah, I think my book, if displacement were a person, they would be hanging around Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, but in that kind of way where they're not as cool as her.
I thought about this for about 10 minutes at the beginning of the panel and then promptly forgot about it. I think all of our books are, with all of our books being like kind of new, like we're all like the awkward new kids kind of looking for friends. I imagine all of our books would like probably, like band together and like make little packs to eat together at lunch. But I think the book that my book would probably like be really odd and inspired by and like shyly like try not to get in the way of would be anything by Tilly Walden, probably, especially spinning. I loved spinning. So I recommend her work a lot to everyone else. Tilly Walden's books are the cool kids that my book really wants to emulate right now.
Okay, so as we bring this to a close, I give you the opportunity for a 30-second shameless plug. Tell us whatever it is you want us to know.
Okay, I do have an answer for this one. I was prepared for this one. My 30-second plug is for Omar's nonprofit organization, refugeestrong.org. As I mentioned, he's leaving tomorrow to go back to Dadaab, and he's going to be doing updates, I think on like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and on his website, just with pictures of the kids he's meeting. The schools are closed now in the refugee camps because of COVID, like everywhere else, but he's still going to try and deliver items to kids. He may actually, this is something he discussed tonight, he may try and do a live stream with students in Dadaab. So like, the date and time isn't set yet, but check the website or Facebook to see if you can live stream with some kids in the refugee camp. So that's my plug.
I guess I'll just plug my social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is CAG Comics, which is just my initials, KAG, and then comics with an X. And keep your eyes out for my next book. It's 2022. It's Anne, a modern day adaptation, sort of, is the title we're working with right now. So yeah.
Wait, can I ask you a question real quick? Is it Anne of Green Gables?
Yeah.
You've got like my two favorite books of all time.
I'll just two quick plugs. On social, I'm at Kiku Hughes, which is just my name. And I really want to shout out two organizations. The first was like instrumental, like necessary for me to finish this project. And it's an organization called Densho. It's an archival organization that collects stories from Japanese American incarceration and makes them available online. It's incredible. They need your donations. So densho.org. And the second is Suru for Solidarity, which is an organization of Japanese Americans working to close concentration camps on the border and to end the separation of families in our immigration centers. So Suru for Solidarity, Tsuru is Japanese for crane, so there.
My social media handles are just at Trungles, Trungles. The organization that I would like to plug is Reclaim the Block. I live in Minneapolis, and so they're an organization that is really, really near and dear to my heart. George Floyd was murdered just a couple of blocks away from where I live currently, and I can walk to the square, and that organization has been on the ground and doing an incredible job organizing, and they have been really wonderful about kind of redirecting people's attention to other organizations that have also kind of been doing the work as well, since they're trying to keep it very local. And so I just wanted to give them a shout out as a local organization that is doing really wonderful things for Minneapolis.
Thank you so much for this fantastic conversation, and your willingness to share these very intimate topics that are clearly near and dear to you, to the point that even, emotionally, and that, we cried with you. But I appreciate that. And thank you, of course, to the NTTBF, as well as the Irving Public Library, Penguin and HarperCollins, Random House, and Macmillan for allowing us this time together. Um, so thank you to all, and good night.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.